Hi everyone. So it's been 2 months. Our shelter in place started in St. Patrick's Day, which would have been the middle of March. I still remember having lunch with my wife at a restaurant, at a Chinese restaurant, and in the middle of lunch, all of a sudden everybody got up and went to the line to get food, more food to take out, and we didn't know why. And then we realized that they had just announced the shelter-in-place program, and then everybody was getting more food to take home. So our practice in place, our morning session, morning practice is essentially the same length of time. It's more than 50 days now. Actually, it's more like 60 days now. And so I wonder. Sometimes I wonder, because I'm having a great time. I'm actually having a great time. So I'm wondering if this is what a Mars colony will look like. That we each get our own little capsule. We stay home. We don't go out. We do everything in the house. We go to work at home using our computer. And then when we get out, then we have to put on our protection to protect us against the elements. And then we have what would be called essential workers that have to be outside. So it's a crazy way of thinking about it. I'm actually, I said, I'm actually having a great time, especially the last 60 days of continuous practice. For 1 hour in the morning, having essentially a online sangha, varying between 14 to 18 people every morning, and also seeing the program evolving and the students evolving. At first, it's all English speaking, even though most of us are bilingual, but we focus on English, and then eventually, because of some of the elderlies, including my parents, who wanted to join, and we became bilingual. So this practice that we have, this morning online practice we have, is done through Zoom, which is true for everything now. It starts at 8 o'clock Pacific time, which is 11 p.m. in Asia, including Hong Kong, Macau, and Malaysia. And it's essentially 1 hour practice. 1 hour practice where we start with 15 minutes of exercise, a special kind of exercise that has also evolved over the last 60 days, that are basically a combination of Master Zhu's joint exercise, which has a little bit of martial art element to it, but not too much. And combine that with the Sisui Jing, which is also from Bodhidharma. It's the other technique, not the Yi Jing Jing. Yi Jing Jing we practice every other week. But the Sisui Jing is the other technique, which means Si is to wash or to clean, and Sui means the bone marrow. I actually like this too. I think the two is very different. I think the Yi Jing Jing, YJJ, is more about, it's much more masculine, I think. It really gives you a good workout. Whereas the Sisui Jing seems to me that is a lot more feminine. It's a lot more about really working on the joints and some of the energy points throughout the body. So that's what we do for 15 minutes. Pretty much the same now. It has evolved, but it's pretty much the same now for 15 minutes. And then we do a 30 minutes total of sitting meditation, which are divided into 2 parts, and it alternates daily between a guided sitting and a silent sitting. So when we sit silently, the first 15 minutes are silent, and when we do guided, then we would I would be doing the instruction to kind of guide people through the the sitting meditation, and we start with a particular posture. Well, I'll talk about that later, and then we do 15 minutes of practice of wisdom, which is practicing the essentially contemplation of the four elements using a particular technique called a small cosmic orbit that Master Jiwa had taught when we were in China in a temple deep in the mountain, and then followed by 15 minutes of practice of compassion, which will be the contemplation of metta. So that's what we do, and the objective of this morning practice, the objective of our morning Sangha, is very simple: is to overcome what we call the 5 hindrances. The 5 hindrances. So the 5 hindrances are all essentially the defects in our mental qualities. So I'll explain that in a minute, and then I'll explain the precise methodology that we overcome these 5 hindrances, which is a combination of the practice of wisdom and the practice of compassion. So first hindrances is what we call the attachment. It's a constant desire to seek sensory pleasures through our what we call the sense doors, the 5 sense doors, are the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the ears, and the body. The body, like the skin of the body. And then in addition it's also it's seeking pleasure mentally. So it's not just the physical part of a body, but also the mental part of the body, right? Going back to our memory, wanting to revisit pleasure experience. Now, keep in mind that seeking pleasure by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when you what is that? How does you say it? When it's really the difference between want and need. It's one thing to say I'm seek for this because I need it. It's what I need to survive. On the other hand, is I seek it because it's what I want, right? What I want, independent of what you need. So it's really it's unreasonable. It's unreasonable attachment and clinging to all the pleasures. Now, interestingly, if you visit particularly if you visit a Tibetan Buddhist temple, you would often see a picture on the wall, and in the middle is a circle with 3 animals. We call that the wheel of life, and the 3 animals really represents the 3 of the 5 hindrances. The first one being attachment, and those 3 animals are a bird, a snake, and a pig. So the bird is actually an ancient animal in North India. It's a pet. It's actually a pet that it gets very attached to the owner, and the story is that if the owner died, the pet would die. Okay, it's that kind of attachment. The second hindrance is what we call anger, ill will, or aversion, and we represent that by a snake. It's basically negativity. Okay, it's a snake is, if you step on a snake, it only knows one thing, which is to bite you, right? Because it's a very negative reaction. So we call that aversion, ill will. It represents anger, feeling of hostility, resentment, hatred, and bitterness, right? We all have that. So then the third hindrances, the third and the fourth are kind of related. The third is what we call sloth. It's inertia. It's almost like you're inside the middle of a drum, that you're not really, it's a state of mind that is very dull. It's like depression. You just don't know what to do. You feeling down, right? So that's represent that with a pig. Okay, just ignorance, basically, just not knowing not knowing a purpose in life. You can say that. Now the opposite of that is what we call restlessness. It's a sense of worry, inability to stay calm. Would be the opposite of depression is hyperness, right? You want to do something, but you can't find the direction to do it. In my days in teaching entrepreneurship, I make the difference between actions and activities. Activities is just you just want to keep yourself busy, but they don't amount to anything, right? It's not a vector quality. It's what we call in engineering what we call scalar. It's just like running around in circles. And then finally, the last element is called doubt. Doubt is lack of conviction, lack of faith. So this is what we call a non-disciplined state of mind, a mind that is completely captivated by this 5 hindrances. It's actually a normal state of mind for us, right? So when we practice meditation, what we want to do is to have discipline, to really elevate the quality of our mind. And so the example that I often use is imagine you crossing the street with your child. What do? Well, you obviously you would when you cross the street where there's traffic, you obviously will hold the hands of your child, right? You would never let the kid just run across the street on their own. You might let them do that on the sidewalk, but you know better than to let them across the street on their own. But in a way, this is like your mind. This is like your mind. We're not used to having discipline in our mind. That our mind is like this child that just runs around. And by having a disciplined mind, by having a practice that allows us to really settle our mind and put it in one place, what we call sati or mindfulness, it's like holding the hand of the child. It's like holding the hand of this mind so that the mind doesn't get kidnapped by the 5 hindrances. Otherwise, the 5 hindrances becomes our mind. Okay, so another example that I like to use when I teach the elderly is to talk about the sun and the dark cloud. That even in the days when there's a dark cloud, you have to believe that the sun is still there. Okay, the sun is always there. So the sun is like the positive energy within you, whereas the cloud is like the 5 hindrances. But we're so used to having that cloud taking over our mind or a positive aspect of our mind that we just thought that would be normal. So our practice is really about pushing aside the 5 hindrances so that our positive energy can come through. Finally, the example I like to use is the one that Master have used often, which is about the banyan tree. How the tree, which strangles the native tree, starts with the seed, and the seed is what we call self, and with that comes all the attachment and the aversions and all the labelings and so forth. So to the point where you no longer see your true nature, right? The tree that was original there in the middle of the banyan tree had finally disappeared, and all you see is the hollowness of the inside. So when we practice, there's something called Jahana or Jahana. In Chinese, it's translated into Chana or Chan or Chan. And then in Japanese, when we get to Japan, it's called Zen. Zen means sentimentation. It's really meaning that how do we let that 5 hindrances settle, right? Settle all the bad seeds, all the 51 mental factors that I've talked about in the past, all the Kusala thoughts, unwholesome thoughts. Just let that settle. And when you can do that, then the Kusala thoughts, the wholesome thoughts, the seeds from the wholesome part of the 51 mental factors would rise to the surface. So this practice called Jhana or Dhyana or Zen or Chant is really the training of the mind to really withdraw ourselves from this non-disciplined automatic responses to any kind of sensory inputs or mental inputs, ultimately leading to a state of what we call perfect equanimity and awareness. So in the Buddhist teaching, they talk about the stages of jhana, right? So this is jhana is actually in the Rupa Dhyatu. So we talk about the three realms. We lived in what we call the desire realms, and there's a higher realm called the Rupa, the form realm, and then there's a higher yet called the Arupa realm, the formless realm. Okay, and now you remember that I had talked about this in how it relates to relativity, as explained by Einstein, that this really has to do with material, the existence of material. You know, that we live in the desire realm is that this is where we use, whereas as you move away from that, you get into a more pure energy state. So the literature talks about the 5 Kusala, 5 wholesome mental factors, the summary that you attain as you attain the first stage of the Rupa Jhana. Now, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that when we talk about our body, our existence, we summarize that by the 6 sense doors, right? I talk about the eye, the nose, the mouth, the tongue, the ear, and the body, plus our mind, our big brain. So together we call that the 6 sense organ, 6 sense door. The Pali word for that is set indriya. Set is 6. Indriya means agreeable or belonging to Indra. Indra is the diva, is the king, the diva king that lives in one of the realm inside the what we call the desire realm. It's above humans, right? What that says is that you have to be careful with understanding these Buddhist concepts, because we're not capable of truly understanding them, because it says that our 6 senses, including our brain, is very limited. We can't really reach jhana with our body. It's beyond us. So when you think about, when you're trying to understand these 5 mental factors, and then ultimately understanding how the relationship with the 5 mental factors with the 5 hindrances, you have to have this in mind, that these are just words. Don't try to really understand the words. Don't try to understand the meaning through the words, because the words are limited and we are limited. But in any case, these 5 mental factors in the literature talks about essentially these 3 groups, that they're 2, 2, and 1. So the first 2 has to do with investigation or examination of our existence, both coarse and precise. Okay, you can look this up. And then the next 2 has to do with the joy or the happiness that we attain as we practice, that are beyond our sensory input. Okay, and then finally the last one is one mind, is equanimity. So these are the 5 mental factors. And in English, you can say the 2 examination, it has to do with one is awareness, which is very coarse, just knowing the existence of your body, knowing your 4 elements, and then the deeper of that would be called contemplation, or vipassana, or insight, or observation. So just just think of that as a placeholder. Don't try to attach too much meanings to it. So the first two has to do with investigation of our existence. The first level is called awareness, and then deeper is called contemplation. Okay, contemplation or observation or insight or vipassana. Okay, whatever works for you. Two levels of investigation of existence. The more coarse one and the deeper one. Whereas the two that has to do with the pleasure, which are non-sensory pleasure, just one we call rupture, and one we call bliss. Whereas rupture is more shallow, okay, more. It's an excitement. It's a sense of happy that you get as you practice. Whereas bliss has much more of a quality or calmness to it, both of which are non-sensual pleasure. Okay, so it's hard for us to really understand it because we're so used to thinking of our existence through a body. So they're talking about existence when you are beyond your body. Okay, so again, there's two levels of investigation and two levels of pleasure. The two levels are awareness and contemplation. The two levels of pleasures are rupture and bliss. Okay, all right, and again, the little bit more on rupture is another way to explain that is empathetic joy. It's a pleasure that you get from knowing that other people it's a pleasure you get from having the delight in other people's well-being. Okay, whereas that's the kind of like the rupture part, whereas the bliss part is the joy that you finally reach jhana. Okay, so two levels of investigation, two levels of joy. Just keep that in mind. Don't try to make too much of it. And then finally, the last one is equanimity, is one mind, is single-minded concentration, unification of the body and the mind. Okay, so 5 of these are the mental factors. They represent the quality of your mind when you reach the first jhana. And in the literature, they talk about these 5 elements, overcoming the 5 hindrances. But before we talk about that, in the literature, they also talk about essentially the 4 jhanas that belongs to the form realm, and then another 4 that belongs to the formless realm. Okay, so the first jhana, when you think about these, is when you have all 5 of these mental qualities, and as you practice and you go to the second stage of jhana, then awareness is no longer necessary, and you end up with just contemplation, rupture, bliss, and one mind. And then again, one more step to the third jhana, contemplation is even not important, and you just end up with rupture, bliss, and one mind. And then finally, when you reach the top of the rupa realm, the form realm, then all you have is bliss and one mind. Now, all of this is very theoretical. I just put it in here for completeness. Okay, so the question is, how does the literature talk about overcoming the 5 hindrances? Okay, again, the 5 hindrances are attachment, which is sensory desire, aversion, which is negativity, ill will, sloth, which is dullness of your mind, and then the opposite of that would be the restlessness of mind, and then finally the doubt. So those are the 5 hindrances. So how does the literature talk about overcoming those 5 with the 5 mental factors? So in the literature, it talks about overcoming attachment with one mind, overcoming aversion with rupture, overcoming joy, overcoming sloth with awareness, overcoming restlessness with bliss, another joy, a higher joy, and then overcoming doubt with contemplation, which is a higher level of investigation. Okay, so that's everywhere you go. That's the literature. Whether you find it in Chinese or in English, that's what it says. Interestingly, that's not the teaching from Master Zhu. that is not the teaching from Master Yu. Now, in my own experiences, is what Master teach makes a lot more sense for me anyway. In my practice, in the last 60 days of daily practice, I finally start to understand Master's teaching. So, very simple. It's actually very simple. In Master's teaching, remember there are two levels of joy: bliss, which is much more immediate, and which is much deeper. Okay, bliss is much deeper, and rupture, which is empathetic joy. Okay, those two are for attachment and aversion. The bliss, this is from Master's teaching now. The bliss, okay, which is the one that is deeper, is for attachment and clinging. Whereas the rupture, the one that comes much more immediate, which is like the sympathetic joy, empathetic joy, is for aversion. Okay? Whereas the two levels of investigation, the one that is more shallow, much easier to attain, which is awareness, is about sloth, it's about dullness, it's about sleepiness. Whereas the one that is deeper, contemplation, is about restlessness. Okay? And then finally, the one mind is about doubt. This makes a lot more sense to me. It really, really makes a lot more sense to me. Okay? Except it's very, very hard to attain bliss and rupture. It's very, very difficult. It's a lot easier to practice awareness and contemplation in one mind. It is very difficult to practice bliss and rupture. I don't even know what that means. Okay? So in our practice, in our daily practice, we basically come up with a combinational technique of practicing wisdom and practicing compassion. And the practice of the wisdom is to overcome dullness and restlessness and doubt. Whereas the practice of compassion is for bliss, attachment or clinging and aversion. Okay, so this is how I visualize it. You know, there's in the Chinese literature, there's a famous battle where almost between the three kingdoms. You probably heard of that. This is a very, very interesting part of the Chinese history. It's been written up in novels. It's called the Three Kingdoms. So the idea is that they constantly fight against each other because they're balance of power. Okay, sometimes these two will fight against this one, and then this one will fight against that one. It's a very interesting part of the history. So anyway, there's a part of the telling the story where one of the kingdom fall into the trap of another one, where they were inside this valley now, and there are enemies in the back, enemies in the front, and enemies in the side. So this is how I visualize our practice, that the 5 hindrances are like the enemies on the 5 sides. On the left-hand side is sloth and sleepiness. On the right-hand side is restlessness. Okay? So this is when we do a sitting meditation, when we practice the wisdom, this is the hardest part, is we have to be relaxed but be alert. Right? Because if we're relaxed and not alert, what happens? Well, we fall onto the left side, we fall into the sloth and sleepiness hindrance, and Master has called this the lazy Zen. We just sit there and we're completely dull. Our mind is not active. We just like it becomes an endurance test. We even might fall asleep. Okay, so the left hand side is the enemy, and they're called the sloth or restlessness. And what you want to do is you want to relax but alert. so you don't fall into that hindrances. So this is called awareness, right? This is one of the 5 mental factors called awareness. Be aware of your breath, be aware of the body, the 4 elements, all that. Whereas on the right-hand side, if you keep your mind alert, but you don't know how to rest your brain. So this is the big part, is how do you rest your brain? This is what we've been calling the non-thinking, not thinking. Don't use a big brain. Let your brain rest, because this is one of the most difficult part of practice. And before I meet Master Guru, I have this problem because nobody talks about the mind, the physical part of the mind, your big brain being part of your body. So when we talk about resting the 6 senses, we're not just resting the eye, the ear, the nose, the mouth, the tongue, and so forth. We have to rest the 6th sense, which is a big brain. So how do you rest that? Because if you don't rest it, then you fall off on the right hand side, and you fall into the hands of the restlessness hindrances. Okay, and so whereas the left is lazy Zen, the right would be called monkey Zen. Your mind goes all over it. So you have to stay on course. And how do you do that? Well, that's when you start to contemplate. You have to start to contemplate. You contemplate your 4 elements. You understand the change in your body. You have to contemplate on your breath, the in-breath and the out-breath. You have to contemplate on the rising and falling of all phenomenons. And finally, you have to contemplate on doubt, because a doubt is the enemy behind you. And you contemplate on that using one mind. Okay, so this is actually, Master had actually talked about that in the past, which when he talks about the 9 abiding minds. There was an article on Patreon that Master's lecture on the 9 abiding minds. The 9 abiding minds start with what's called the invert abiding, continuous abiding. That's part of the contemplation, and then finally it's called the calm abiding. And the example that he had used is like the mouse the cat already caught the mouse. Okay. And the mouse is just sitting there, and the cat is looking at the mouse. And then when the mouse moves, the cat, go boom like this and catches the mouse again. So this is when we finally get to the part where we're completely calm and we're observing our breath, and we start to observe the pause, right? The silence between the breath. Because when we practice anapanasati, often people ignore the sati part. It's about in, out, and rest. So this empty part is really the door to our mind. And this is where we see the doubt. And we just focus on that. This is when we get to the 3rd stage of the 9 abiding mind. When the doubt comes out, we go bam, like this, with one mind. And we go from one breath to another, right? So this is all good in theory. This is what we do. So when we practice wisdom, that's what we do. We are trying to overcome the 3 hindrances. The one on the left, which is sloth and dullness. The one on the right, which is restlessness. We're trying to find the balance between them, being totally relaxed and totally alert. All this time fully aware that we have enemies in the back, which is called the doubt. And we just finally focus on the doubt using one mind. So that takes care of the 3 of the 5 hindrances using the practice of the wisdom, which is really about sentimentation. It's really about taking the 3, these kusala, these unwholesome thoughts, and just let it settle. Now, the 2 in the front, right, are the sensory, are the attachment, clinging, and aversion. And if you have to rely on these 5 mental factors, relies on either the bliss or the rupture, I tell you, that's beyond my capability. That's beyond perhaps your capability, right? So this is like the general who got stuck in this valley, facing enemies who have taken up positions. He can't fight all sides. It's not possible for him to fight all sides, right? Especially when most of the hardest parts are in front of him. So how does he do that? Well, the story was that, remember, there was 3 kingdoms. So he went to the other kingdoms and form alliance with the third kingdoms, and then finally convince them to attack the second kingdom, his enemy, from behind, right? So I'm kind of overusing the synergy, the analogy here, but the point is that since we couldn't do that with the practice of wisdom, we use the practice of compassion. Use the practice of compassion, right? Now, so after the first 15 minutes, then we switch gear and we start to practice what we call the contemplation of metta. Okay, so but before we talk about that, I think it's important that we mention a set of writing done by a Indian monk. He was from India, but he actually practiced in Sri Lanka. So he's actually a Theravada monk. He was born in the 5th century Common Era. So he exists 1,000 years after the death of the historical Buddha, and he wrote a very, very important treatise that summarizes all of the teaching of the historical Buddha into 40 objects of mindfulness. Okay, so it's important for us to really understand that, because otherwise we become very territorial. We say, okay, I'm practicing Zen and you're practicing this. You have your world mind. We just have to understand that every practice, all these practices are just choice of objects. Okay, so the easiest one is, for example, the easiest one to think about is the mindfulness of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. People do that when if you know anything about Pure Land, they practice the mindfulness of the Amrita Buddha. That's one of the objects. Another object is mindfulness of just the body. Mindfulness of the space, mindfulness of the earth, water, and fire, mindfulness of morality, mindfulness of death, mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of how the 4 elements interact with each other, which is really what we do. I'll talk about that in a minute, which is what we call the Microcosmic Orbit. Is one method of meditation. One method of mindfulness is just how the 4 elements of a body interact with one another. And finally, there is the mindfulness of the 4 immersibles, which are called Brahma Vihara. Brahma is the Brahman king who lives in the first jhana, right? So rather than trying to attain the 2 quality, the bliss and the rupture, that you get when you reach jhana, it's as if you're asking for help. It's as if you're asking for the help of the Brahman king, so that they can attack your enemy from behind, right? So for the 4 immersibles, these are called the Brahma Vihara. Vihara are the house or the cornerstone of the Brahman king, which are metta, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy. There he is, right? And equanimity. So we try to overcome the remaining 4 hindrances, the attachment and the aversion, by practicing compassion, by practicing the 4 immersibles, by practicing the Brahma Vihara. Okay, so the Brahma Vihara, once again, is loving kindness, compassion, joy, or empathetic joy, or empathy, depending how you want to interpret it, and equanimity. So in particular, the loving kindness, as Master Jiu had explained it, is to eliminate all hostility, is to eliminate aversion. Okay? So, coming back, a little bit more on the program. I'm going to again describe kind of the program, which is the exercise, the 10 minutes the 10 minutes of exercise, which is combination of Master Jiru's joint exercise and Bodhidharma's Caesar Jing. It's all about relieving the blockage in a qi. And qi is a Chinese word that means air, but actually what it means is energy. And the energy is something inherent in the body, okay? And it's, as far as I can understand it, it's like magnetic energy. It's, when you have electricity, it generates magnetism. So on the other hand, if the electricity is not coherent, the magnetism will cancel each other, you won't see it. So it's all about having the coherence between the mind and the body, between our breath, our nerve system, our thoughts, all the body functions that generate electricity. If you could achieve coherence and achieve synchronicities between the left and the right side of a body, the yin and the yang, then that magnetic energy would appear. Okay, so the exercise is all about clearing the blockage of the qi. And then we would start to sit, and when we sit, we practice this technique called the 7 support points of the Vajrachara Buddha, which is sitting in a posture that starts with the legs, the hands, the spine, the shoulder, the forehead, the tongue, and the eyes. So those becomes the support points, and we sit with that posture throughout our 30 minutes. And if this is a guided meditation, we would eventually start this technique called the Microcosmic Orbit, which is a technique that Master Jiru had taught in some way very similar to I Ching Ching. And where we cycle, where we start to scan the body from the bottom of the spine to the top of the head, and as we breathe in, and we scan the front part of the body from the forehead all the way to the abdomen when we breathe out. And as you do that, you would generate an energy within you to support your mind. Okay? And then we practice what is essentially the silent illumination from the Soto Zen tradition, which is Chan, which is Chinese Chan, where we're remaining alertness, essentially both awareness and contemplation, right? That in the Soto Zen they call it Shinkatasa, which is only sitting, but what it means is really one mind sitting, and it's built upon this idea of silent illumination. Okay, I have talked a little bit about that in the past. So anyway, in summary, our morning practice, which I hope all of you can join. And if you don't know how to do that, just leave a comment on the video, or if you follow the link that I put on the video, you would find a description of a morning practice, and that's how you contact us. So this morning practice is about 2 approaches, 2 combination approaches. One is the practice of compassion, using loving kindness and generosity to overcome aversion and attachment. And 2 of the most important 5 hindrances. And then in addition is the practice of the wisdom, using awareness, contemplation, and one mind to overcome sloth or dullness, restlessness, and doubt. Okay, I hope this helps. Thank you. Bye-bye.